This is chapter 4, the market forces of supply and demand. Supply and demand are the two words economists use most often, and for good reason. Supply and demand are the forces that make market economies work. They determine the quantity of each good produced and the price at which it is sold. If you want to know how any event or policy will affect the economy, you must think first about how it will affect supply and demand. This chapter introduces the theory of supply and demand. It considers how buyers and sellers behave and how they interact with one another. It shows how supply and demand determine prices in a market economy and how prices in turn allocate the economy's scarce resources. The questions to be answered in this chapter are: what factors affect buyers' demand for goods? What factors affect sellers' supply of goods? How do supply and demand determine the price of a good and the quantity sold? How do changes in the factors that affect demand or supply, affect the market price and quantity of goods? How do markets allocate resources? First, let us define market. In the last chapter, we defined market as an institution that brings buyers and sellers together, a group of buyers and sellers of a particular good or service. Buyers as a group determine the demand for the product. Sellers as a group determine the supply of the product. We assume competitive market. A competitive market is where many buyers and sellers each has a negligible impact on the market price. And so a perfectly competitive market is where all goods are homogeneous or exactly the same. Buyers and sellers are so numerous that no one can affect the price, so they are called price takers. Quantity demanded is defined as the amount of goods that buyers are willing and able to purchase. The law of demand states that other things being equal, when the price of a good rises, the quantity demanded of the good falls. And when the price falls, the quantity demanded rises. In other words, the demand is the inverse relationship. The law of demand is the inverse relationship between price and quantity. So let's look at an example of Sam's demand schedule. A demand schedule is a table, and it shows the relationship between price of a good and quantity demanded. So here is Sam's demand schedule for lattes. The price ranges from 0, 1, 2, 3, all through 6. And the quantity demanded starts from 16 when the price is 0 to 4 when the price is 6. It is important to note that Sam's preference obey the law of demand, the inverse relationship between the price and quantity. As you can see, price is increasing from 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and quantity of lattes demanded decreases from 16, 14, 12, 10. That schedule is going to be plotted. We plot the demand curve from the demand schedule. So this is Sam's demand schedule represented as a demand curve. So you plot the points on the two-dimensional graph, and as you can see, a figure is emerging and the beautiful straight line. It is important to note that it is a negative slope. And the negative slope is the reflection of the law of demand, the inverse relationship between price and quantity. From individual demand, we can derive market demand, sum of all individual demand for a good or a service. Market demand curve is the sum the individual demand curve horizontally. To find the total quantity demanded at any price, we add individual quantities. So the market demand is simply a horizontal summation of individual demand. So here, market demand versus individual demand. Suppose the market has two individuals, Sam and Dean, are the only two buyers in the market. How can we derive the market demand? So we show the schedule for both Sam and Dean, and we can see the quantity demanded at each price. And the market demand is simply adding Sam's demand at zero price is 16 plus 8. At a dollar, Sam demands 14, Dean demands 7, so we add 14 to 7 to get 21, and the trend continues. So as you can see, the market demand is simply a horizontal summation of Sam and Dean's demand. That is the market demand. And we can plot that demand schedule, and it is now a red demand curve, and that is the market demand for lattes. Demand curve shifters. The demand curve shows how price affects quantity demanded, other things being equal. These other things are non-price determinants. Other things or demand curve shifters are non-price determinants, the things that determine buyers' demand for a good other than the good's price. Changes in them shifts the demand curve to the right or to the left. These are the demand curve shifters. Sometimes we call them the determinants of demand. Number of buyers is a determinant of demand. An increase in the number of buyers increases quantity demanded at each price, and that shifts the demand curve to the right. A decrease in the number of buyers decreases quantity demanded at each price, and that shifts the demand curve to the left. Suppose the number of buyers increase at each price, P and QD will increase by 5 in this example, and you can see that there is a shift in the demand to the right. That is an increase in the demand because of an increase in the number of buyers. Income is the second determinant of demand. And when we talk about income, it is important to distinguish the kinds of goods consumers purchase into normal and inferior. Normal goods, other things constant, an increase in income leads to an increase in the demand, and that shifts the demand to the right. An inferior good, other things constant, an increase in the income leads to a decrease in demand. In other words, a normal good, there is a direct relationship between income and demand. If income goes up, demand increases. If income goes down, demand decreases. Inferior good has a negative relationship. When income increases, demand curve decreases. When income decreases, demand curve increases. Price of related goods are either substitutes or complements. Let's talk about substitutes. Two goods are substitutes if an increase in the price of one leads to an increase in the demand for the other. For example, pizza and hamburgers are substitutes. An increase in the price of pizza increases demand for hamburgers, shifting the hamburger demand to the right. Other examples include Coke and Pepsi, laptops and tablets, music CDs, and music downloads. Compliments. Uh, Two goods are complements if an increase in the price of one leads to a decrease in the demand for the other. For example, computers and software. If price of computers rise, buyers people buy fewer computers and therefore less software. Software demand curve shifts to the left. Other examples include college tuition and textbooks, bagels and cream cheese, eggs and bacon. These are examples of complementary products. Taste is the other determinant of demand or a curve shifter. Anything that causes a shift in taste towards a good will increase demand for that good and shift its demand curve to the right. An example, the Atkins diet became popular in the 90s, caused an increase in the demand for eggs, shifted the egg demand to the right. Expectations about the future is another determinant of demand. If consumers expect an increase in income, increase in current demand, people will reduce their savings and increase their purchases. If consumers expect higher prices in the future, there will be an increase in the current demand as people will rush to purchase the item before price goes up. Example, if people expect their incomes to rise, their demand for meals at expensive restaurants may increase now. Summary of variables that influence buyers. Price of a good itself represent a movement along the demand curve. In other words, price of a good itself or own price does not shift the curve, but will move along an existing demand curve. Income shifts the demand curve. Price of related goods shifts the demand curve. Tastes shifts the demand curve. Expectations shifts the demand curve. Number of buyers shifts the demand curve. Let's do an active learning exercise. Draw a demand curve for music downloads. What happened to it in each of the following scenarios and why? Number A, the price of iPods fall. Number B, the price of music downloads fall. Number C, the price of CDs fall. Number A, the price of iPods fall. That is the demand. Price of music on the vertical axis, quantity of music on the horizontal axis. Music downloads and iPods are complements. A fall in the price of iPod shifts the demand curve for music downloads to the right. That is what it looks like. Okay. Number B, the price of music downloads falls. And here, when the price of falls, price is represented on the vertical axis, as we have seen before. Own price does not shift the demand, but moves along an existing demand curve. So demand curve does not shift, move down along curve to a point with lower price and higher quantity. C, the price of music CDs falls. When the price of music CDs fall, music CDs and music downloads are substitutes. A fall in the price of music CDs shifts demand for music downloads to the left, as shown in the graph. Supply, the selling side of the market. Quantity supplied is defined as the amount of a good sellers are willing and able to sell. The law of supply states that other things equal, when the price of a good rises, the quantity supplied of the good rises. When the price falls, the quantity supplied falls. Uh, a supply schedule. Let's look at a supply schedule, plotting a supply curve from a supply schedule. A table, this table shows a relationship between the price of a good and the quantity supplied. And this is quantity of lattes. Um, Starbucks Supply is a supplier of lattes. And as you can see, the plot, we plot this table into the graph and a positive graph emerges. That positive graph is called the supply curve. And the shape of that curve represents the law of supply. The law of supply is the direct relationship between the price of a good and the quantity of the good. When the price increases, the quantity supplied increases, and vice versa. Market supply versus individual supply. Like demand, we can come up with a market supply by summing horizontally the individual suppliers. So, market supply, the sum of the supplies of all sellers of a good or service. Market supply curve, which is the sum of individual supply curves horizontally. To find the total quantity supplied at any price, we add the individual quantities. Suppose Starbucks and Pete's are the only two sellers in this market. How do we arrive at the market supply? Again, we have a schedule that shows how much Starbucks will supply at the various prices, how much Pete's will supply at the various prices, and then to arrive at the market supply, when the price is zero, Starbucks and Pete's will supply zero, so the market supply will be zero. When the price is $1, Starbucks will supply 3, Pete's will supply 2. You add the 2, and the answer is 5, and you continue down until you get to $6. Starbucks will produce 18. Pete's will produce or supply 12, and the total is 30. The market supply is simply a horizontal summation of individual suppliers, and you plot that information and you get a positively sloped supply curve. The market supply. Like demand, supply has shifters. Those are non-price determinants of supply. So, supply curve shows how price affects quantity supplied, other things being equal. What are these other things? These other things are non-price determinants of supply. Changes in these determinants shift the supply curve. For example, these are the supply curve shifters. Number one, input prices. Supply is negatively related to prices of inputs. Examples of input prices include wages, prices of raw materials. A fall in input prices make production more profitable at each output price. Farms supply larger quantity of each at each price, so supply curve shifts to the right. And you can demonstrate this on the graph. Suppose the price of milk falls. At each price, the quantity of lattes supplied will increase by 5 because milk is an input into the production of lattes. And so when the price of milk falls, more lattes will be supplied. Technology is the second determinant of supply. Technology determines how much inputs are required to produce a unit of output. A cost-saving technological improvement has the same effect as a fall in input prices, and it shifts supply curve to the right. Number of sellers is another supply curve shifter. An increase in the number of sellers increases the quantity supplied at each price and shifts supply curve to the right. Expectations about the future is another determinant of supply curve shifter. For example, events in the Middle East lead to expectations of higher oil prices. Owners of Texas oil fields reduce supply now, save some inventory to sell later at the higher price. Supply curve shifts to the left. Sellers may adjust supply when their expectations of the future prices change. If good, no, if good is not perishable, of course. Summary: variables that influence sellers. Number one, price of goods itself. The price of good itself or own price does not shift the supply curve, but it represents a movement along an existing supply curve. The determinants that shift the curve include input prices, technology, expectations, number of sellers. These will shift supply curve either to the right or to the left depending on the event. Active Learning 2. Draw a supply curve for tax return preparation software. What happens to it in each of the following scenarios? Number A, retailers cut the price of the software. Number B, a technological advance allows the software to be produced at lower cost. Number C, professional tax return preparers raise the price of the services they provide. Let's look at the answer. Number A fall in the price of tax returns. We start with S1 and the corresponding P and Q1. Supply curve does not shift. It moves along the curve to a lower price. Okay? A fall in the price of tax return is not one of the determinants that shift the curve. Own price is a movement along an existing supply curve. Number B, a fall in the cost of producing software. We start with S1 and supply curve shifts to the right at each price. The cost of producing software will lead to an increase in the supply of software, and that is a right shift of the supply curve. Number C, professional preparers raise their prices. Okay, trick question. This shifts the demand curve for tax preparation software, not the supply curve. So professional preparers raise their price does not affect the supply, it will affect the demand curve. So I hope you saw that trick coming. Supply and demand put together to establish equilibrium. Equilibrium price has reached the level where quantity supplied equals quantity demanded. That point where supply and demand crosses each other is called equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. In this graph, equilibrium price is $3 and equilibrium quantity is 15. Equilibrium price, that is a price where quantity supplied equal to quantity demanded, and that is $3 equilibrium price, and 15 is equilibrium quantity. What does the expert say? Price gouging. Connecticut should pass its Senate Bill 60, which states that during a severe weather event, emergency, no person, I beg your pardon, Connecticut should pass its Senate Bill 60, which states that during a severe weather event emergency, no person within the chain of distribution of consumer goods and services shall sell or offer to sell consumer goods or services for a price that is unconscionably excessive. What do the uh, economists say? 77% disagree. What 16% are uncertain, and 7% agree. Okay. Uh, when the markets are not at equilibrium, surplus results, or what we call excess supply, that is, quantity supplied is greater than quantity demanded, and that occurs when the price is above equilibrium. For example, if the equilibrium price is $3 and price is established at $5, that will lead to an equilibrium because quantity demanded, as you can read off the demand curve, is 9 lattes, and quantity supplied, as you can read off the supply curve, is 25. There will be a surplus of 16 in the market. Facing a surplus, sellers try to increase sales by cutting price. In other words, a surplus in the market leads to a downward pressure on prices as price gravitates towards equilibrium. This causes quantity demanded to rise and quantity supplied to fall, which reduces surplus. Price continue to fall until market reaches its equilibrium. Shortage is an excess demand. Is the quantity demanded greater than quantity supplied, and it occurs when price is established below equilibrium. An example, $3 is the equilibrium price, but if the price is $1, which is below equilibrium price, a shortage will result. Therefore, we will have quantity supplied is 21, quantity demanded is 5, and when you take the difference, there's a shortage in this market of 16. A shortage in the marketplace will result in an upward pressure on price as price gravitates towards equilibrium. So, facing a shortage, sellers raise their prices, quantity demanded falls, quantity supplied rises, which reduces the shortage. And this continues until equilibrium in the market is established. So, supply and demand together. There are three steps to analyze changes in equilibrium. Okay. Number one, decide whether the event shifts the supply curve, the demand curve, or in some cases, both curves. Number two, decide whether the curve shifts to the right or to the left. Number three, use the supply and demand diagram, compare the initial and the new equilibrium, and if effects on equilibrium price and quantity. Let's use a graph to demonstrate this. Price of hybrid cars and quantity of hybrid cars. What happens? There's the demand, there is a supply, and the P1 equilibrium and Q1 is the equilibrium. Event to be analyzed. There is an increase in the price of gasoline. How does that affect this market? Step one, the demand curve shifts. Because price of gas affects demand for hybrids, S supply curve does not shift because price of gas does not affect cost of producing hybrids. Step two, demand curve shifts. Because high gas prices makes hybrid more attractive relative to other cars, consumers will want to buy more, and that will shift the demand to the right. Number three, the shift causes an increase in the price and the price and quantity of hybrids. Price will increase from P1 to P2. Quantity will increase from Q1 to Q2. Changes in supply. A shift in the supply curve occurs when a non-price determinant of supply changes like technology. Change in the quantity supplied, a movement along a fixed supply curve occurs when price changes or on price changes. Changes in demand. A shift in the demand curve occurs when a non-price determinant of demand curve like income or number of buyers change. A change in quantity demanded, which is a movement along a fixed demand curve, occurs when own price changes. Let's look at a shift in supply. An event technology reduces cost of producing hybrid cars. Step one, supply curve shifts because event affects cost of producing. Demand curve does not shift because production technology is not one of the factors that affect demand curve. Step two, supply curve shifts right because event reduces cost, makes production more profitable at any given price. And as you can see, supply shift from S1 to S2. Step 3, this shift causes price to fall from P1 to P2 and quantity to rise from Q1 to Q2. Event, a shift in both supply and demand. Price of gas rises and new technology reduces production costs. Step 1, both curves will shift. Step 2, both shifts to the right. Step 3, quantity rises, but the effect of price is ambiguous. If demand increases more than supply, prices, if demand increases more than supply, prices will rise. Another event, price of gas rises and new technology reduces production cost. Step 3, quantity rises, but the effect on price is ambiguous. But if supply increases more than demand, price will fall. Active Learning 3, Shifts in Supply and Demand. Use the three-step method to analyze the effects of each event on the equilibrium price and quantity of music downloads. Event A, a fall in the price of music CDs. Event B, sellers of music downloads negotiate a reduction in the royalties they must pay for each song they sell. Number C, events A and B both occur. The market for music downloads is represented in this graph. Steps that we are going to examine. Step 1, demand curve shifts. Step 2, demand curve shifts left. Step 3, price and quantity falls. A fall in the cost of royalties. Supply curve shifts to the right. Royalties are part of seller's cost. Number 2, supply curve shifts right. And number 3, price falls and quantity rises. Number C, fall in price of music CDs and fall in cost of royalties. Steps. Both curves shifts. Number 2, demand shifts left, supply shifts right. Number 3, price falls. Effect on quantity is ambiguous. The fall in demand reduces quantity. The increase in supply increases quantity. How prices allocate resources. Markets are usually a good way to organize economic activity. One of the principles we studied in chapter 1. In market economies, prices adjust to balance supply and demand. These equilibrium prices are the signals that guide economic decisions and thereby allocate scarce resources. Summary. Economists use the model of supply and demand to analyze competitive markets. Many buyers and sellers are price takers. The demand curve shows how the quantity of a good demanded depends on the price. Law of demand. is as the price of a good falls, the quantity demanded rises. The demand curve slopes downwards. Other determinants of demand are income, price of substitutes and complements, tastes, expectations, and number of buyers. If one of these changes, demand curve shifts. If one of these factors changes, the demand curve shifts. The supply curve shows how the quantity of a good supplied depends on the price. The law of supply: as the price of a good rises, the quantity supplied rises. The supply curve slopes upwards. Other determinants of supply include input prices, technology, expectations, and number of sellers. If one of these factors changes, supply curve shifts. The intersection of supply and demand curves determines the market equilibrium. At the equilibrium price, quantity demanded is equal to quantity supplied. The behavior of buyers and sellers naturally drives market towards their equilibrium. When the market price is above the equilibrium price, there is a surplus of the good, which causes market price to fall. When the market price is below the equilibrium price, there is a shortage, which causes the market price to rise. To analyze how any event influences a market, we use the supply and demand diagram to examine how the events affect the equilibrium price and quantity. These are the steps. Decide whether the event shifts the supply curve or the demand curve, or both. Number two, decide in which direction the curve shifts. Number three, compare the new equilibrium with the initial one. In market economies, prices are the signals that guide economic decisions and thereby allocate scarce resources.